today. It looks like we finally have spring acting like spring around us rather than the winter-spring transition we've had the last several weeks. So we have plenty of things to talk about. Lots of climate, lots of water, not so much drought to talk about this time. We'll touch on that as we go along here. So again, a reminder of all the partners that we have working on this, working across this. Again, a great example of partnership across federal and state agencies in sharing and collecting information. Our next updated, or our next webinar will be May 16th. Aaron Wilson from the Ohio State Climate Office and OSU Extension, the Ohio State University, I guess, or the Ohio State Climate Office, it should be. You can check out our webinars at the links below there and pass those on to other people. These will be put up. We'll wait and see how long Doug says they'll be, but then the next day or two they should be available. So our agenda for today is going to be touch on what our current conditions are, putting things in a little context, always a good place to start because that has a big influence on where we're going from here. Talk about some of the major storm events, and we do have major storm events again to talk about. Unfortunately, I harassed Becky from last month that her big storm wasn't enough. We had to do another one for me to deal with. Talk about the impacts on water, flooding, ag, and some other ones. And then we'll talk about the outlooks, what NOAA has to say for us and what that means. The picture here is from, I shared from Aaron Wilson from Ohio State. We do have had some spring severe weather already. Not a ton of it, but enough that it is aware of. Okay, so kind of review and some current conditions. We'll head off into this as we look at from the air, the James River in South Dakota before we got rid of all the snow. So taking first a step back at the previous month, March temperatures were in the middle of the distribution. The white states are considered near average, and the ranking is at each state. They were below the middle, below median, below average. But still considered near average for the white states. The blue states were somewhat lower, and you see most of those are in the plains area down to Arkansas and Kentucky in our region. The only places that were above average were in the Southwest and for March. If we look at precipitation, we're somewhat all over the place. It's pretty clear from this. You can see where the storm track was throughout the month of March. States from the Intermountain West into the Central Plains were at the top of the distribution. Colorado and Nebraska come in at 6th wettest March on record, with some other states in the middle of the country being in the above average category. A number of states around that were closer to average from this standpoint. And then Montana is out here at number 2. Number 2, the second driest March on record, and dry and lots of the south and east. So clear where pretty much that storm track was through the middle part of the country. So that's looking back at March. Looking back a little further, there's some really interesting things that help set the stage for other things we're going to talk about. In the upper left, we have those same rankings, but for the first part of the year, January through March. On the right-hand side, we go back the last 6 months, so that's October through March. And then on the lower left-hand side is April through March, the last 12 months. And there's a pattern that sticks out very clearly throughout this region, throughout almost all of our area that we're dealing with here. The last 3 months, 6 months, and year are well on the wet side. The last 6 months, Iowa would be number 4. Kansas number 3, and a lot of top 10s. Tennessee, not quite our area, but the record wettest last 6 months. And then if we go back the last 12-month period, not the wettest individual year, but the wettest year for this time period, April through March, wettest on record for Iowa and Wisconsin, down to Kentucky and states to the east. And then some other states around us that were top 10, top 15. You see Missouri sticks out a little bit, not being quite as wet. The main reason that sticks out was because of the pocket drought area that we had centered on Missouri last year really kind of sticks out sticks out there. And then some dryness as we look further west. Not terribly dry, but not as wet as we had been in the middle part of the country. And just note that you can go make these yourself. This is a NOAA product for the National Center for Environmental Information. You can go make these rankings for various time scales yourself. Another ranking on this, that looking at what's happened this winter in the way of snow. We have a plot, a quickly made plot from the Midwest Regional Climate Center. Plotted here, the main numbers are the rankings for this snow season, so that from last fall until now, where they rank on their all-time totals. And then the number on the upper right is how many inches of snowfall they recorded this year. So you see lots of top tens, several records, and these are not short-term periods of record. We're looking at 80 to 90 years of data in some cases, where we have set all-time snow records throughout, everywhere from Colorado up into the Great Lakes area. The 222 inches in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan does stick out to me as an interesting situation to live through. Interestingly enough, and this was pointed out by Mike Timlin at the Midwest Regional Climate Center, to the southwest of this area and the eastern Corn Belt, even into parts of southern Michigan, we were on the bottom 20 to 30 on snowfall totals. So while we had lots of snow up in this area, the southeast part of the region did not have as much snow, even up into some snowy places like Michigan, South Bend, Indiana, that we would expect to get more. Okay, in contrast to that, we've talked about there being a lot of water around because of precipitation over the last 6 months, year. The last 30 days, we've had a bit of a flip in the situation here, which has had some interesting context to it. The upper left-hand side, the last 30 days precipitation, the purple areas are the wetter, the browner areas are drier. Actual precipitation totals up here in North Dakota, we're on the order of a quarter inch or less over the last 30 days. That's pretty low for this time of year. How these compare to percent of normal, you see on the lower right-hand side, and you see only a few pockets of wetness, and some of those were quite wet. You're looking at 150, maybe to double average precipitation in some areas, but with some wider spread areas that are quite dry, from Kansas up in Iowa, southern Wisconsin, parts of Michigan, and that area into eastern Montana, North Dakota, coming in at less than 25% of average, even less than 5% of average in some of these locations. While we're at the same time talking about major flooding issues here in a little bit, southwest Iowa is coming in at less than 25 and 50% of average in some places. So that has provided some interesting context. It has helped the ag community in allowing the start of some drying out of soils and some field activity, and even one comment about some browning of grass starting to occur in a few places. But this has also been a benefit in allowing some of the recent flooding to abate while this has happened. Last 30 days, departure from normal temperature. Parts of the plains slightly above to maybe 2 degrees above average, a little bit above average for this time of year. And then from the eastern Dakotas down into around Lake Michigan, slightly below average. So despite, much of this has occurred after that very cold start we had to the beginning of March. So not too far out of whack comparatively, since we came after that major cold area. Starting to put this in some context now, what this means for stream flow. Where we are on a ranking scale on the way of 7-day average stream flow. The black areas are highest on record. You see a few of those around, but not quite as many as we've seen some other times. Lots of blue, we're in the 90th percentile throughout parts of the Dakotas, even in Iowa, southern Wisconsin, and parts of Illinois. And then a lot of green, where the drying out has let stream flow come down to moderate for this time of year. And then a few pockets, I mentioned some of the dryness starting to manifest itself in some lower stream flows in Michigan. Now, when we're talking lower stream flows, we're talking low comparatively for this time of year. Stream flows tend to be higher this time of year because of additional precipitation and snow melt. So low does not necessarily mean really low, just low comparatively. those lay over very well as we're looking at what's happening in the way of soil moisture. The upper left-hand side, a NOAA product, and this is the soil moisture anomaly, how many millimeters above average you are. That same area where we've had the most precipitation, we're looking at 4 to 6 inches above average soil moisture content in these areas, with less wetness in the eastern part of the Corn Belt, where it's been we've not had as much recent precipitation. A product from the Climate Prediction Center gives the percentile ranking, and you see the darker green still at the 99th percentile for soil moisture across a good portion of the upper Midwest, with some lessening of that as we get down into Missouri and over up around Michigan, Ohio area. So even though we have seen some drying, we're still quite wet historically from a soil moisture standpoint, and some drying starting to show up in the soils up here in Montana and North Dakota as we've thawed out now. Okay, since we've had that much moisture, we look at the US Drought Monitor, lots of white is what we would expect to see because we don't have a lot of drought anywhere on the US Drought Monitor. Only a few pockets in the far western part of our area, a little bit in Montana, little bits of D0 and D1 in Wyoming and Colorado. And the Colorado is kind of a carry-on from what we've had there the last couple years. So the coverage right now is 4.6% of any kind of coverage. And didn't have a chance to look at the details, but that may be the lowest we've ever had in this region ever at this point. Only 0.77% of the area has D1, and there's nothing larger than D1, so not dryness issues going on. And this 8-state area, what we call the Midwest area, this is the 8th straight week with nothing on it, and that is by far the longest period we have had with no coverage on there. There are a couple 1-week shots a couple times during the last 19 years since we've had the US Drought Monitor, but not a multi-week one, and now we're on week 8. So an incredible stretch here of wetness manifesting itself in the US Drought Monitor. Okay, so now we've seen kind of our context. We're going to review a couple events here, a couple big events that have had some big impacts on us, talk a little bit about impact, and then we'll get on to some water and ag issues. We do jump back to the big winter storm, the winter storm number 1 we had back in March that Becky covered last time. There are still some ongoing issues related to that. You see one, this is a road going into West Point, Nebraska, and the damage. This is a common scene in eastern Nebraska and western Iowa, even parts of southeast South Dakota, where you had so much water that has really removed a lot of that roadway. So there's a lot of work that has to be done, and that road damage is some of it's minor, but a lot of it's very major. I-29, the map shows where I-29 is closed. This is Omaha right here, and this is the border between Iowa, southwest Iowa and eastern Nebraska. There's a large chunk of I-29 that is closed, not expected to be open until June. And there's a railroad line in this area that is still not reopened. I think that's the last major line that they're still trying to get opened. We had to wait for water to go down and then do repair work. Lots of road repairs are going to have to be done. That's going to hammer budgets, state budgets and county budgets very heavily, because there's a lot of pavement to replace and a lot of gravel that has to be done even on lesser roads. That's going to take a lot of work to be done. There's from a crop standpoint, there's going to be a lot of acres. In the overall context, the number of acres is not going to be huge, but there are a lot of acres locally that are not going to be able to be planted this year, either because they were flooded and have trash and sand over them, has to be remediated. Some of them are still wet or still underwater. We've got water in some of the bottomlands of Missouri that is confined now because behind levees and can't drain, so it's going to have to be pumped out. Or in some cases, they may not be able to get access to the fields because of roads not working. So we've got some serious issues still going on from this earlier event. And this is contributing some mental health issues, especially in the ag community overall, because of not only these major events, but because of the overall ag economy having some larger ones. But that's beyond the scope of what we're going to talk about here. So we're going to move on to winter storm number 2, the one that occurred about a week ago. The first winter storm was Nebraska took the bigger brunt of it, South Dakota some. This one was more focused on South Dakota and parts of Minnesota. I think the overall impacts were not quite as large, but we're still accumulating them. You know, we had a couple different issues. Picture from Lake Andes, South Dakota. We had lots of livestock issues we're going to talk about here. On the left-hand side, in around Sioux Falls and parts of northwest Iowa, southern Minnesota, ice was the issue this time. Ice and very strong winds. So we had some significant accumulations of ice with strong winds along with them that did a lot of infrastructure damage. So the area we're looking at here, and this was, again, also a very significant blizzard centered on eastern South Dakota, central South Dakota, parts of western Minnesota, 20, and we do have confirmed 30-inch amounts, real historic kind of snow events. And those were coupled with widespread 40, 50, and even 60-mile-per-hour wind gusts. They were more focused on southeast South Dakota, but a lot of snow and a lot of wind to move around. And here's a picture from Clark, South Dakota, showing some of those amounts. Again, the focus of it was over most of South Dakota into part of western Minnesota. The ice area, I'll kind of outline the ice area that was most impacted was down in this region. And the strong winds with ice, the added ice accumulation did a lot of infrastructure damage to power lines and some other issues. We know that there's lots of livestock losses. We'll talk about this a little bit more. Numbers are still being accumulated on that. The additional amount of water is adding to the flooding, exacerbating the flooding, particularly in eastern South Dakota, somewhat in Minnesota, because unfortunately it's not a big flush that's putting a new big strain on issues, but we're adding to that flooding. There were some transportation issues, and again, trees and power lines took real beatings. This is Fostoria in northwest Iowa, near the Iowa Great Lakes, lots of tree damage because of the ice accumulation. One other interesting feature we had here was dust that was brought from the southern plains. This was an incredibly strong storm system. I don't think it reached the bomb cyclone stage, but it was still very strong. And the strong winds had produced significant dust issues in parts of West Texas and eastern New Mexico. You can see where that plume is drawing it right up into the middle part of the U.S. So from Sioux Falls into southern Minnesota and Iowa, there was dirt accumulation. You can see a picture from Minneapolis, the orangish, brownish accumulation on the snowfall. And then in parts of Iowa, we had rain that was just left more dust on the vehicles than the actual rainfall. Was an interesting scenario. Okay, we're going to touch on, going to jump out of that now to agriculture and where we are. Just an image here from the National Phenological Network showing where we are in the way of spring accumulation is leaving and leaf out, and where we are, basically Nebraska over to southern Iowa and to the eastern Corn Belt. Northern areas still haven't quite made it along here yet. So touching on some ag issues right now, where we are in the way of soil temperatures.
Hey Dennis, can you go back? Can you go back to that phenological image again and just tell people what the blue and the orange mean?
Okay, the blue is the where we are in indicating this was late accumulation, late onset of spring conditions with the cold this year. Not quite as bad as last year, but still a late onset. The lighter blue is we're this late every 1 to 4 years. The darker blue every 5 to 10 years. But then oddly enough, while we were ahead or we were behind in our spring accumulation, the darker areas further south were ahead on the way of spring dormancy break. Just south of the Ohio River Valley, you were, a fairly quick, here every 11 to 20 years was fairly significantly ahead compared to some of the other areas. And this is outside our area, but they've been hearing lots of comments about pollen issues, the early start, and producing some very severe pollen issues down in the southeastern part of the U.S. Okay, jumping on ahead to soil temperatures, a graphic indicating, the areas that are in the greenish there are in the 50-ish range. That's a temperature range where corn could be planted and be appropriate. Wheat can develop at 40 degree temperatures, so that's still further north. And then further south, we could get to cotton or soybeans. We need up around the 60-degree temperatures that way. But the limitation so far has not been as much on soil temperatures, but wet conditions and getting access to the field. For those not involved in agriculture, wet soils, one, they're a nuisance to get into because they can slow you down. But if you go into a field that's too wet, you can compact soils, and when you do that, that is detrimental to your crop planting and development. So very cold soils still up north where we have the overall wetter conditions, and still melting off a little bit of snow. Pete Boulay from the Minnesota Climate Office noting in far northwest Minnesota, they still have some chunks of snow, significant chunks of snow they have to get rid of. Overall, not a lot happening in row crop agriculture. Reports from USDA, state reports, USDA National Agricultural Statistics from Brad Rippey, the Office of the Chief Economist. Winter wheat, this is wheat that is planted in the fall and then re-terminates in the spring. The percent good to excellent, the winter wheat in the eastern part of the Corn Belt, because of the wetness last fall and overall weak conditions so far this spring, the amount that's in good to excellent is quite a bit behind, and a lot more that is in poor to very poor conditions. Most of the regions out further west are actually in a little bit better shape. And then, we're still a little bit early in the winter wheat, breaking dormancy in some of the places in the plains. Small grains are about the only thing that we get planted too early further north. Spring wheat in the left-hand side and oats on the upper right-hand side. Oats are quite a bit behind in Iowa and Nebraska, largely again because of the very wet soil conditions. And then spring wheat is really no spring wheat that has been done, so it is behind up there also. Corn progress, we're still early in the planting season, so there's only a little bit of delay. There's prep work field work being done to get moving along. We are delayed because of wet conditions last fall. Some of the things they would have done last fall, they pushed till the spring, and the wet conditions and snow melt have slowed things down. Because of this, there's been a rush to apply anhydrous ammonia. It's a way of applying nitrogen for crops. There have been numerous reports around of slow deliveries on anhydrous, people trying to get that on too quickly, and have had a couple problems with anhydrous spills. When that does spill, it produces ammonia, which is a problem. So National Weather Service has had to work a couple of these issues so far because of drift from anhydrous spills, and this has been fairly common mentioned around the region. Other ag issues, alfalfa damage from Ohio to Iowa due to the cold, freezing without snow cover, and multiple freeze thaws. Again, general wetness slowing things down. There has been more planting progress started in the eastern Corn Belt where we have it a bit drier. Reports out of the southern part of the Corn Belt's been about being beautiful so far, and that was the area we pointed out was a little bit ahead of average overall, and from that standpoint. Other ag issues, livestock, we're still dealing with the livestock issues we mentioned about the March event in Nebraska and the April event in South Dakota. There are a number of calf losses. This is a time of year when people are calving, and there were non-insignificant losses, maybe not as bad as people thought, but people were doing unbelievable efforts trying to maintain in the middle of this blizzard, get out and get calves, because they'd have to get out and get the calf and try to get it to a warmer place after it was born. There were reports of people sleeping in trucks and checking on livestock every couple hours and still losing calves because they were dropping in the middle of that storm, or they just didn't have enough place for them to be in out of the elements. So, and there also can be additional issues that we can't deal with yet because of the stress that were put on these early on. So the losses could mount after this point. Again, the numbers are being accumulated. The reports out of South Dakota that I was seeing maybe were not as bad as they were expecting them to be. Still was problem, but the overall impacts may not have been too bad so far. Okay, we're moving on to water issues now, since we have ample water issues to talk about. Just kind of put us in context here where we're looking now, especially from a Missouri River standpoint, where we are in the way of snowpack. We've talked a little bit about water in the plains. Now we've got water in the what's happening in the mountains. The upper circle area is roughly the area that flows into the Missouri River system. Most of the snow areas here are near average to somewhat above 120, 130% of average. So there will be a decent amount of runoff there. In the Platte River Basin, not quite as much in northern Wyoming, but in the Platte River coming out of Wyoming and Colorado, similarly above average. Good issues for some of these areas that have been in drought, especially reports out of Colorado. This snow has been very good for them because of some ongoing water issues that we're seeing here. What that means from a runoff standpoint, and these are plots from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, what that's meaning into the Missouri River system. This is the snow accumulation. The blue is the snow accumulation in inches of water equivalent and the accumulation throughout the year. The red line is the average, and we are around that peak time. And you see both places, the area above Fort Peck and Fort Peck to Garrison. We did peak just slightly above the overall average due to some recent snow accumulation, probably close to that peak accumulation, and would expect this to start to fall off and that runoff from the snow melt in the mountains to be getting in the Missouri River system. We're still evacuating some of the water from the plains, and now we're expecting some of from the water for the melt off from the mountains to be coming our way. The North Platte, we have peaked above a little bit here in the North Platte and the South Platte. So we're going to have good amounts of water coming down those areas, 112% in the North Platte and 107% in the South Platte. Okay, going to hand it over to Kevin Lau now to talk about from the flooding standpoint and the National Weather Service.
Okay, thank you, Dennis. This is Kevin Lau with the Missouri Basin River Forecast Center, but I'll be speaking about the entire upper Mississippi Valley. Just kind of give you a snapshot of what's happening right now and looking ahead 4 or 5 weeks or so. So we'll start with the Ohio River Basin. There's really no huge concerns there. There is some ongoing minor flooding along the Wabash. That's the colored dots that's just below Lake Michigan there. So I guess I should describe the graphic on the right-hand side with all the dots. Those are the river gauges that we put out forecasts for. Green is good. Green is a positive thing. That means that we don't have flood at that location. The colored dots, the oranges, the reds, and the purples, that's not so good. Purples are the worst. That's major level flooding. So again, the Ohio looks okay. Moving to the upper Midwest, as Dennis already mentioned, that snowfall that we had this time last week, April 9th to the 12th, it did continue some flooding and exacerbated some of the flooding that was already going on. For instance, the Red River of the North, it received some of that snow in its headwaters. The Red River of the North has major flooding ongoing, and some locations are expected to crest next week. The Minnesota River also has a place or two that's in major. Most of it, I think, though, is in moderate, and it, too, is expected to crest. The Minnesota is expected to crest next week. The Mississippi River remains in flood for much of its length from St. Paul down to into Iowa. The river is actually on the rise, but I'm told that from downstream of Keokuk, Iowa, down to St. Louis, it's in a steady to falling pattern. So the upper reach of the Mississippi is actually rising, while the lower portion, Iowa down to St. Louis, is steady. Again, in both the Ohio and the upper Midwest, the soils remain wet, as Dennis also pointed out, and so we still are vulnerable for on again, off again flooding. In fact, that goes for the Missouri River Basin itself. As Dennis just discussed, the mountain snowpack in the Rockies that feeds the Missouri River is near average, and so we do not expect flooding from mountain snowmelt. Mountains are not a concern to us this year. We still have flooding ongoing in the Big Sioux and the James, and they received some of that snow last week that brought a few places up, and as far as it's a new crest. Basically, that was along the Big Sioux, and so the Big Sioux and the James both have flooding going on. The James actually has major flooding, and if you know anything about the James, it acts sort of like a reservoir instead of a river. So some places along the James may not crest until early May, first half of May. The Missouri River itself is in minor flooding in two stretches, one of them above Kansas City and the other one below. The one above extends from Nebraska City down to St. Joseph. It's about 160 miles. It remains in minor flood. And then downstream of Kansas City from Napoleon down to Miami is in minor flood as well. Both of those sections will likely stay in flood through late May. And again, in the Missouri Basin, especially the eastern half of the Missouri Basin, soils are wet, tributaries are still running high, and so we are vulnerable to any new precipitation that would come in. And so that's sort of just a snapshot of what's going on. Things are beginning to turn for the better, but any new rain is going to bring renewed flooding. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Dennis.
Hey, Kevin, before you do you just want to say a couple more words about typical May and June type rain events? We call them convective events, but rain events really, especially in, anywhere in the Midwest for that matter.
Yeah, so May is a particularly active month, at least for us here in the Missouri Basin. I'm sure that's also true for the Mississippi and Ohio as well. So thunderstorms can dump a lot of rain real quick. They're hard to predict when and where, and so it's hard to give much of a lead time on those. But as we've all experienced over the past couple of years, it seems that whenever we have a rainstorm, it usually is a big one anymore. So any of these rivers any of these tributaries to the main stem rivers, if a storm hits it just right, we'll see new flooding. And from what I've seen, and probably what Dennis has already pointed out, it is supposed to be an active pattern next few months. So I expect that we're in for the long haul.
Okay, thank you, Kevin.
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, and just to spin off that a little bit more, some more information from the Army Corps of Engineers. The water levels on the Missouri will continue to be running fairly high as the Corps will be doing some releases from the major reservoirs to draw down. They have moved into the flood control area, so they're going to be drawing those down, and then working, as the snowpack or as the snow melt works its way down, they'll be working from that standpoint. So, okay, couple other water issues, a couple other pieces of information from also from the National Weather Service on the Mississippi. Number of places on the Mississippi reach top to 8 to 10 crests, and Davenport currently is at 26 days at major flood. The longest stretch that has been done was 31 days, and there's a very good chance that they could break that record. And that's kind of indicative of the flood on the Mississippi this year, that it wasn't a record high one, but it was a very prolonged one and major all along the way. And the Red River flood is ongoing. Kevin did address that. We have a picture from Adnan Akyus from the North Dakota State climatologist showing what's going on at the Red River. Looking where we are in the Great Lakes, to touch on the Great Lakes a little bit, we still do have a little bit of ice. Total Great Lakes ice cover is 8.2%. A few pockets in the side areas of Lake Superior, a little bit off of Lake Huron, and a bit on the end of Lake Erie. Water temperatures are starting to rebound in the far western part of Lake Erie and the far southern part of Lake Michigan as we do reach some warmer temperatures here. Fire, the other positive about the overall wet conditions is fire conditions have not flared up, so to speak, very much. Did get some reports in Colorado from fire starting. Even under wet conditions, you still can get fire before grasses start to green up. The expectations right now for May and June from the Predictive Services branch is that we're not expecting major issues at this point in the way of fire. Okay, then we're going to move ahead to the outlooks. We've put ourselves in context now. Talked a lot about flooding and the water issues. What's going to happen next will be a big issue as to what potentially additional issues we could run into, or if we have any more additional issues. So we'll talk about El Nino, we'll talk about some of the outlooks, and then about our growing season. Just to touch on where we are in the way of El Nino, the area along the equatorial Pacific running at about a degree C, or that's about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit above average. So we are in El Nino conditions now. Below in the sea surface temperatures, not sea surface temperatures, but below the surface, we do have a significant amount of warming recently. So it looks like El Nino is going to stay with us. The probabilities of El Nino and the 3-month periods, March, April, May here, the red bar is the probability of El Nino. So you can see that March, April, May, all the way to June, July, August, September, the probability of El Nino is the highest, staying above 60% most of the way through the summer. So we're expecting that to be with us. And that is influencing what we're going to see in the outlooks. It's a little bit uncommon to carry an El Nino through the summertime. It is more of a wintertime phenomena. It was late developing this year, finally developing in the springtime. We are watching this ongoing as to what will happen to the El Nino next winter. So let's go ahead and look at the outlooks and see what the influences are here. Next 7-day precipitation, the upper Midwest, again, upper plains, less amount of precipitation expected. Getting down to the southern part, Kansas, Missouri, over into the eastern Corn Belt, a couple inches of precipitation again is possible. That is an area that can handle a little bit more precipitation right now, but the soils still are fairly wet, even though the surfaces have dried. So we can have, this could add to some of those flooding events, though the Ohio River right now is not one of the rivers that is overall of concern.
And Dennis, that's just to be clear, that last graphic is the accumulation of over 7 days.
Correct.
That's the amount of, that could be 2 or 3 storm systems. I think in this case it's probably 2. But anyway, go ahead, yes. Dennis. Thank you.
And the other thing is we are at a time of year where this is convective. So this doesn't necessarily mean that everyone in this area is going to get all of that rainfall. That it tends to be a bit more spotty, so not everyone will necessarily get that amount, but this is a possible accumulation in some of these areas. Jump ahead to the 8 to 14-day outlook, which will be out of date here within about 20 minutes when the new one is released, but a change in what we've seen recently on the left-hand side, pretty decent chances for above average temperatures throughout our whole region. So that will help to hopefully dry conditions out a little bit and warm soils to start getting spring field work going. Unfortunately, along with that, we do have a slightly increased chance of precipitation. So this is again looking at the week 2 time period, end of April into the beginning of May. Probabilities here on precipitation are not high, but given our overall wet condition right now, that is a problem that we need to be aware of.
And Dennis, just to be clear again, that's probability of above normal precipitation. Yes. That's a slight tweak towards above.
So jumping to May, again, we're all the rest of these are in probabilities now. The chances for May temperatures just lean slightly towards the warm side over most of the eastern part of our region. Parts of Kansas and Colorado have a slightly increased chance of below average temperatures, and the warm extends through the northern plains. None of these probabilities are very high, a little bit in the eastern part of the Corn Belt. Most of the area through May is EC, equal chances for below or above average precipitation. We don't have enough information to say one way or the other. But over into the plains and mountains area, slightly above average chances for precipitation continue. So could have a chance for more rainfall, a little better than average chances for rainfall out in that area.
And Dennis, once again, some of those higher elevations may see accumulation of more snowfall as well, snowpack.
And only part of that area, most of that area is outside what would go into the Missouri River system. More of it would be in the plains area, only a little bit in Wyoming. May, June, July, a similar pattern in the way of temperature, though the area that it has a higher chance for below average temperatures extends in the central plains. Warmer areas further west and further east. It is an interesting contrast when we look at the precipitation probabilities. This is a 50% chance of above average precipitation. That's fairly high, and this whole area is actually fairly high given we're in a May to July, more convective type of season. Not often you see this from the Climate Prediction Center. So throughout the plains, we have an increased chance for precipitation, highest centered on Wyoming in that area, and then more equal chances up over the Great Lakes area. And then we'll skip ahead just 1 month for the main part of the growing season, June to August. Very similar pattern. Precipitation chances are eased a little bit, and that area of below average temperature goes away, and mainly EC, equal chances. So this is going to be interesting to watch. If this area can see an increase, this whole area does see an increased chances for precipitation, given how wet we are right now. That could lead to some issues with pending how much additional rainfall there is. Does it lead to ongoing flooding? From the ag perspective, it could be ongoing disease issues with crops and continued problems with delayed planting. We'll have to keep an eye on that as we go along. The drought outlook, given the situation I've shown you, very little increased chance of drought occurring. There will probably be some pockets of drought show up during the growing season. There almost always are. Right now, they should not be widespread, and it's hard to pin down exactly where they are. So, summary of where we are right now. Wetness at large time scales, some record-setting periods. The impacts are dealing with wet soils, ongoing flooding in a lot of different areas, and delayed ag activity. The cold in much of our area avoided some crop issues on perennials. Drought is nearly non-existent in our region, very small areas only. And then we did have another major winter storm causing livestock and some other issues in April we talked about. From our outlook standpoint, El Nino, kind of in a weak to moderate right now, likely to stay with us through summer. I think is going to influence what we're going to see here. El Nino years, you tend not to have too many drought issues overall, and it doesn't look like that's going to be the case this year. Slight chance for warmer conditions far east and west in our region. Cooler chance in the central plains, and then equal chances for temperature throughout much of the summer. And then a chance of wetter over much of our region, especially as we get into the latter spring, main part of summer. And our drought issues are likely going to be limited the way it looks right now. So just a reminder of all of our folks and links of some of our people involved. And thank yous to all of the folks who helped contribute to this. And let's see if we have any questions right now.
All right. Well, thank you, Dennis and Kevin, for your summations there. I did have a hand raised pretty early in this presentation. I'm going to see if Steve McIntosh wants to ask his question or a comment. Steve, you had your hand raised. Do you have a comment? Maybe you didn't mean to.
Yeah.
What's that?
Can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah,
Or
go
we
ahead.
can.
Yeah. I just had a comment that the flooding's making a big news splash down here in Missouri, as far as the senators and the elected officials, and I guess the people in Iowa as well, according to the newspapers. We got a lot of people blaming the birds and the fish for the flooding, and a lot of people, I guess the farmers are, and the environmentalists are blaming the farmers, but they don't seem to be blaming the hydrologic extremes that we're having. So I think there needs to be some science out there about what's really happening on the river and why it happened as far as this recent flooding, because they're wanting to change the master manual on the river again. Just bringing that point of view. That doesn't, a lot of political people making points, but there's not much science in what they're saying, I'm afraid.
So, Steve, I won't get into the politics at all. This isn't the time and place for that. But what I will say is that there has been some science done on more recent heavy rainfall events and actually runoff in the Missouri Basin and other basins as well. But the one I know most about is the Missouri, and the fact that runoff has increased variability between years and annual runoff, especially in the upper basin. And the upper basin includes, by the way, everything above Sioux City, has seen higher variability. So one year it can be very wet and the next year it can be very dry, like 2011, 2012, for example. So you see higher variability since about 1975 or so, and that variability has trended up. So if you start looking at some of the runoff volumes annually, you'll see that they're happening with a little more frequency, and that's just water in the stream coming down. Doesn't really have anything to do with this is just measuring the amount of water in the rivers purely. As we all know, the 2011 scenario was quite different than the scenario in 2019 in terms of major flooding. One was very much an upper basin flood with a huge snowpack and all that business, and a lot of rain in May, by the way. And then the 2019, very much a late winter, I'll call it, scenario where we had a pretty severe late winter and a lot of conditions below the major reservoirs that contributed to that flooding. I think there'll be some papers and research done on that over the next few years. But I appreciate the comment. Now, some of the questions that we got include this one. And Dennis, you're going to get to answer many of these. So is it possible for there to be no planting this growing season throughout a significant portion of the Midwest due to excess moisture?
Significant? No. There will be chunks of areas that will, I mentioned some of the areas that had been flooded, or some of the areas that are wet, that are frequently wet. There will be some areas that will not be planted. I would not expect there to be significant areas that do not get planted. We are still in mid-April, relatively early in the corn planting season. We can go to, we can plant corn until a month from now. We'll start losing some yield. But before, the late planting date for corn, I think, is somewhere near the end of May. So no, I would not say there will be significant area losses.
It kind of related to that in a couple different ways is another question, again, from Benjamin Diamond. Sorry, I should have said that. How widespread is the trash/sand coverage? And I think that's two things in one. He may be referring to how widespread is the dust coverage, which was very, very broad and wide. And then the other part is how widespread is, if you will, the damage done to fields due to sand, other junk floating in and having to be removed from fields. as well as holes and ruts and all those kinds of things that were done. Would you say that is widespread in terms of impact, or do you think that's localized based on river bottoms, that kind of thing?
The places where you have a lot of this accumulation is going to be focused on river bottoms. It's going to be Missouri River bottom, places along the Platte and along the Elkhorn, and probably some other areas where you had some fluky stuff that happened
Missouri,
because we had water going everywhere during that March event. And there's just been so much deposited that they will not be able to get that cleared this year. So for them locally, yes, that will be a very serious problem. But from an overall context of numbers of acres impacted, it will be relatively small. So the decreased productivity because of that in the way of corn and beans is going to be quite small.
Locally, it's going to be a major effect, of course, depending upon who the individual is, as well as maybe some counties and
yes,
and such.
And yes, for them, I'm not denying the fact it's going to be serious for them, and that's what's led to those stress issues I mentioned earlier. But from an overall context, there won't be much loss in corn and beans due to them.
Right. Just a comment from Adnan, the North Dakota state climatologist. That picture that you saw of the Red River Valley was his. He also mentioned that the Red River Valley did, in the southern part of the basin, did already reach its peak last week. The northern part of the valley is expected to peak next week. There'll be a secondary crest due to all the snow melt from that second blizzard that you mentioned, Dennis, last week. And then, but the second peak won't be as big as the primary. I want to make sure people understand that. Was soil, okay, a question from Verlin Barnes from NRCS. Was soil saturated and tributaries running relatively high in the May? The potential for, if normal rain at least falls in May, or even heavier than normal rains, what types of, he says, what types of warnings should we be getting to local people? And I'll sort of answer that and say that this is one way that kind of information gets out. There's a lot of state, tribal, federal entities on this call, as well as newspapers and other media. We hope that this sort of service continues to keep people aware of the potential for impacts. Again, there's no absolutes in this business, unfortunately. I guess we'd all be trillionaires if we did have those, if we knew exactly what was going to happen. So all we can say is the situation has a heightened risk at this point until things dry out a bit, and that risk level depends upon where you live. So most people sort of know what they're in for based upon where, or what their risk is based upon where they live. In most cases, I won't say that in all. Okay. The location of this recording. Okay, Bruce asked that question. Bruce, we do put this, I'll write back to the whole group here in just a minute to show you where we put this, these recordings, so you can access it later. So hang on. I'll send out a note via this list. You'll see it in just a moment. I'm sorry I didn't see that a little earlier. Okay.
Doug, while you're looking, let me go back on Verlin's comment. Not only will there be potential for flooding in certain areas, we probably will have some areas that will get some additional rainfall that will slow their planting or change what they're needing to do with acreage this year, just because we have so much water in the system. Even when I mentioned the soil, how dry it had been the last 30 days in some of these places, still the reports coming out of the weekly crop reports are saying complaints about it's still wet and we're struggling to get out and get things done.
Okay. There's a question about private dams that I don't have an answer to. So, Kevin, I don't know if you can know the answer to this either. It says, are private dams queried for river predictions? And maybe, Kevin, if you're still on here, Kevin Grebenau, I'll have you comment.
Can you hear me?
We can, yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, so we have about 82 dams that we incorporate in our river forecast model. Most, if not all, are either state or federal. I mean, we do have a couple of private hydroelectric, utility dams that we do get information for, but for the most part, they're either state-owned or federal.
Okay. Okay. Hopefully, Kevin, that answers your question. Still going down the list here. Just a comment, something we probably didn't get across very well, but just to say that there was significant damage to fields in the floodplain in northeast and eastern central Nebraska. Some of those were mentioned, obviously, the Platte, Elkhorn, but also Niobrara and such, not only fields, but grazing land and everything else. Thank you for that comment, Nathan. Given the turbulent weather we've seen so far this year, any comment on the expectations of severe weather? And that's an actually very interesting question. I will start that, and please, Dennis and Kevin, chime in. Expectation, I don't have a lot of expectations, though it often helps not to have severe weather when you have cooler than normal conditions across the plains. There is somewhat of a leaning towards cooler. I think, if I remember correctly, on that those May outlooks, Dennis, maybe flip back to that real quick. If somebody wants to comment on that, feel free.
I know there's been work done on El Nino status and severe weather. I don't remember off the top of my head what the results of those were.
Yeah, the only thing I'll say about that is we could have a very active severe weather season and have very few populated places sort of hit by it. And people will say, well, we didn't have much severe weather, even though the science, if you will say, oh, gosh, we sure did. On the other hand, we could have a very dead severe weather season and have one outbreak hit one major, again, populated area, and people think it's the worst year for the last 50 years. So remember that when you're trying to look at your years. Stuart, thank you for chiming in.
So basically, yep. Doug just said it depends.
No, I certainly won't do a prediction on severe weather this time of year. But we are getting into that season, and it certainly is something to be aware of. Stuart says 60 miles of levees along the river in Mills and Fremont County. Those are in Iowa, southwest Iowa, still have many breaks, and flooding will be serious throughout the runoff season, and the people will be affected by that down there for quite a time. Yeah, he even points out access to farms and buildings west of Hamburg. He says until October. So there'll be a lot of recovery. And to be honest, Dennis, the other thing you said was, and I think we heard this from the Corps as well, is that river levels will be high throughout the summer. That will keep the groundwater levels relatively high as well, which doesn't help a lot. One other comment is that when we have there's a flood-caused lake that is 100 miles long and 5 miles wide. That's a large body of water. Oh, does that affect anything around it in terms of weather and such? And yes, certainly. So getting back to soil moisture again, and sort of standing water and such, and extra water just being around, laying around, if you will. Absolutely. There are local and sometimes regional impacts from that. You can see those in the Great Lakes, for example, lots of impacts from that. But when you have huge areas of wet conditions, especially in the summertime when it gets really hot, and evaporation and evapotranspiration can happen really readily, and Dennis will talk more about this, I think, in just a minute. That can generate quite a bit of moisture in the air, as you all know, and make things not only uncomfortable in terms of heat stress, but can also regenerate, if you will, that water into precipitation generally in a localized area. Dennis, would you want to comment a little more about that?
Yeah, it's an interesting balance between the two. Wet surface where you have lots of evapotranspiration or lots of evaporation from open water tends to cool that surface. So there's lots of moisture available there. But that cool surface, when you get back to talking about severe weather or trying to kick off storms, you also need some sort of lift to cause rising motion. And when you cool that surface, you remove one of those areas of lift. So it's a delicate balance between providing moisture and providing more the amount of heat you need to help produce lift. So it's a complex interaction between those two that you have to almost deal with on a case-by-case basis. Certainly wet soils, open water conditions, when you're trying to evaporate those, do keep things cool around them.
And I guess we'll use this as our final question, and I noticed we didn't talk about it, and I was going to mention it. I'm sorry I didn't, but Plains Snowpack. Dennis, do you want to say a couple words about Plains Snowpack, and if there is any left?
There's little bits left. Most of it is gone at this point. So we're the rivers are evacuating the water from that. The one advantage that has come with Plains Snowpack that I did not mention from the ag side, those places that have rangeland, pasture land, heavier snow amounts tend to be good because it provides a lot of moisture for them. So while the livestock producers did take a beating from livestock mortality, they're expecting to have a pretty good growing season in the way of grasses.
And just one more point of interest. According to the Corps of Engineers, March was for the month of March, I believe, and if I'm wrong, Kevin Grody, you can raise your hand if you're still on. I guess he's not. March was the highest runoff amount they've seen in the upper basin. I believe that was what he said. Is that correct, Dennis?
Yeah, March was
on record.
11 million acre feet, and the combined March-April was 19 million acre feet. For comparison, their average year is 25 million acre feet. And the amount of water beat 1952, which is a well-known flood year on the Missouri River. So another example of the extreme amount of water they were dealing with.
Yep, these are extremes we're not used to dealing with. So it certainly was, a record year in many ways. I'll just leave it at that. Thank you very much, everybody, especially the presenters and those of you who asked questions, and I hope we answered them well enough. If we didn't, you can always email or call us at any time to get more information like that. I am going to stop the recording and